history is often remembered in the broad, chaotic strokes of rebellion: the shouting mob, the burning effigy, the uncontrolled riot. We are taught to visualize the Boston Tea Party as a moment of unbridled anarchy, a frenzy of axe-wielding patriots tearing apart the symbols of British tyranny in a blind, chaotic rage. But if one zooms into the grain of the wood on the deck of the Dartmouth on the night of December 16th, 1773, a singular contradictory detail emerges that disrupts this entire picture of lawlessness. Amidst the systematic destruction of 342 chests of tea, a cargo valued at approximately £9,659, which translates to nearly $1.7 million in today's currency, the Mohawks, as they styled themselves, committed a minor infraction that troubled them deeply. In the heat of their operation, they accidentally broke a padlock belonging to one of the ship's captains. It was a small piece of personal property, insignificant compared to the fortune in tea leaves floating in the harbor. Yet the very next day, the Patriots returned to Griffin's Wharf. They did not come to gloat, nor to destroy more property. They came to replace the padlock. This single replaced padlock is the perfect crystallization of the American Revolution's central paradox. These were men committing high treason and engaging in immense property destruction. Yet they were obsessed with the appearance of law, order, and morality. They were radicals who swept the decks clean after committing a crime to ensure no non-political property was damaged. They were revolutionaries who respected private property, provided it wasn't the wrong kind of property, the kind owned by a state-sponsored monopoly. But here is the contradiction that we must distill today. You have been told since grade school that the Boston Tea Party was a revolt against high taxes, a desperate act by impoverished colonists crushed by the financial thumb of King George III. The slogan, "Taxation Without Representation," is burned into the American psyche. But according to the raw economic data and the parliamentary records of 1773, this is a pervasive myth. The Tea Act of 1773 did not raise the price of tea for the colonists, it effectively lowered it. The legislation was technically a tax break, a corporate bailout designed to flood the American market with cheap, high-quality tea, undercutting the smugglers who were essentially the drug lords of the 18th century Atlantic. So if the tea was cheaper and the tax burden was lighter, why destroy it? Why risk the gallows for a discount? Welcome to Distilled. Today we are decanting the murky, brackish waters of the Boston Harbor to understand the single most famous act of defiance in American history. We are distilling Defiance of the Patriots by Benjamin L. Carp, a book that reconstructs the gritty, soot-stained reality of that December night, moving beyond the pageantry to the people who held the hatchets. But we aren't stopping at the popular narrative. We are going to cross-reference Carp's social history with the economic iconoclasm of James R. Fichter's tea. Consumption, Politics, and Revolution, 1773 to 1776. Fichter's data suggests something uncomfortable, that the Tea Party might have been a failure in its immediate goal, that Americans didn't actually stop drinking British tea, and that the colonial boycott was as porous as a sieve. We will look at the corporate ledger of the British East India Company to see the first too-big-to-fail bailout in history. We will analyze the sociology of the Mohawk disguise, why grown men smeared their faces with soot and red ochre to play savage. And finally, we will ask the hard question. What does the destruction of tea tell us about modern corporate protests, from the aisles of Target to the boardrooms of big tech? This is not the story of a polite tea party. This is the story of a corporate war, a smuggling ring, and the violent birth of an American identity. The Gathering Storm. To understand the explosion of December 16th, we must first understand the pressure cooker that was Boston in 1773. As Benjamin Carp details in Defiance of the Patriots, Boston was not merely a city of aggrieved taxpayers. It was a city on the edge of a nervous breakdown, isolated by the British Empire and distrusted by its own neighbors. The popular image of the Revolution is a unified American front, but Carp reveals that in late 1773, Boston was seen by many other colonies, particularly the mercantile elites of New York and Philadelphia, as a mob-ruled, erratic instigator. Bostonians had a reputation for violence and street riots that made the landed gentry of the South nervous. The radicals in Boston, led by the Sons of Liberty and the master propagandist Samuel Adams, needed a win. They needed to prove that they were the vanguard of liberty, not just a chaotic rabble. The catalyst for this confrontation was the arrival of three specific ships: the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. A fourth ship, the William, had run aground on Cape Cod in a violent storm, a forgotten detail that underscores the precariousness of 18th-century logistics and saved that vessel's cargo from the harbor's bottom. These ships carried the controversial cargo: chests of Bohea, Kongu, Souchong, Singlo, and Hyson tea from the British East India Company. These were not just beverages, they were the physical manifestation of a parliamentary policy designed to break the colonial will. The timeline of the crisis, as distilled from Carp's narrative and primary sources, is a masterclass in escalating tension. On November 28, 1773, the Dartmouth arrived in Boston Harbor. The law of the sea and the customs house dictated that the cargo must be unloaded and the duties paid within 20 days of arrival. If the duties were not paid by midnight on the 20th day, the customs officials were legally empowered to seize the ship and the cargo, landing the tea under the protection of the British military. The deadline for the Dartmouth was midnight, December 16th. This created a hard deadline, a ticking clock that drove the Sons of Liberty to action. The standoff was immediate. The Patriots, led by Samuel Adams, demanded the tea be sent back to England without payment. However, Governor Thomas Hutchinson, a rigid loyalist who had previously had his house sacked by a Boston mob during the Stamp Act crisis, refused to grant the ships a pass to leave the harbor. He was determined to uphold the letter of the law and force the issue. Hutchinson believed that if he stood firm, the radicals would blink. He was wrong. The colonists set up a watch, a rotating guard to ensure the tea was not secretly unloaded at night. The ships were trapped at Griffin's Wharf, caught between the mob on the dock and the Royal Navy ships blocking the harbor exit. Tensions rose daily. Pamphlets circulated through the streets, proclaiming, "That worst of plagues, the detested tea, is now arrived in the harbor." The hour of destruction, or manly opposition to the machinations of tyranny, stares you in the face. The body of the people. Carp highlights a crucial political innovation in colonial resistance: the meeting of the body of the people. The official town meeting was a legal entity, subject to British regulation and the governor's power of dispersal. It was restricted to qualified voters, property owners. The Sons of Liberty needed a broader mandate. They convened unofficial mass gatherings known as the body of the people. These meetings, held at the Old South Meeting House because Faneuil Hall was too small to hold the crowds, were far larger and more inclusive than the official voting rolls allowed. They included the lower sorts: apprentices, laborers, seamen, and those without property who were usually excluded from the political process. This was a radical expansion of the political sphere. It allowed the leaders to claim a democratic legitimacy that superseded the legal authority of the Crown. On the morning of December 16th, over 5,000 people, nearly a third of Boston's entire population, crammed into the Old South Meeting House and the surrounding streets. The atmosphere was electric, cold and damp, smelling of unwashed wool and coal smoke. They waited for one last word from Governor Hutchinson. The ship owner, Francis Roch, had been sent to the governor's country estate to beg for a pass to let the Dartmouth leave. When Roch returned at nightfall to report that the governor had refused, Samuel Adams stood up. According to tradition, Adams spoke the code phrase, "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." Immediately, a war whoop went up from the galleries. Men disguised as Mohawks appeared at the door. The meeting dissolved not into chaos, but into a directed military-style operation. The discipline of the mob. The participants in the Tea Party were not a drunken rabble. Carp's prosopographical research, the study of the common characteristics of a historical group, identifies them as a cross-section of Boston society. They were artisans, shoemakers, carpenters, and merchants. They were young. The majority of the documented participants were under the age of 40, and 16 were teenagers. The operation at the wharf was marked by a startling efficiency. The men divided into 3 groups, one for each ship: Dartmouth, Eleanor, Beaver. They appointed leaders and boatswains to direct the work. They demanded the keys to the hatches from the captains and even requested candles to see the work. But they were careful to use the candles only in a way that wouldn't threaten the ships with fire. Primary sources, such as the account of George Hughes, a shoemaker and participant, described the visceral labor of the night. The chests were heavy, some weighing 400 pounds. They had to be hoisted out of the hold using block and tackle. Once on deck, the men used hatchets to smash the wooden crates. But the tea wasn't loose, it was packed tight, sometimes trodden down by feet in China to maximize cargo space. The men had to chop through the compressed blocks of leaves to ensure they would sink and spoil. The sheer volume of tea, 92,000 pounds, created a physical problem. It began to pile up in the shallow waters of the low tide, forming mounds that rose above the gunwales of the ships. Boys were sent over the side to beat down the tea into the salt water, ensuring it was ruined and wouldn't be salvaged by thrifty locals. This discipline extended to theft. The goal was political protest, not looting. When one man, Charles Connor, was caught stuffing tea into the lining of his coat, he was treated with swift brutality. He was stripped, beaten and covered in mud. The crowd was ready to tar and feather him, but he managed to escape, bruised and naked, into the night. This incident serves as a grim reminder. The non-violence of the Tea Party was strictly regarding the ships, not the people who violated the code of the protest. The Mohawk disguise. Why did they dress as Native Americans? Carp and other historians argue this was not merely a disguise to avoid identification. After all, a blanket and some soot is a poor mask for a man whose neighbors have known him for 20 years. Many of the participants were recognized by name during the event. The disguise was symbolic. By donning the guise of the Mohawk, the colonists were shedding their British identity. The Native American represented the savage, the untamed, and the distinctly American. It was a rejection of the refined, corrupt, tea-drinking culture of the London parlours. It allowed them to act outside the norms of British law while claiming a new indigenous legitimacy. Furthermore, the Mohawk persona was a terrifying symbol to the British. It evoked the fear of the frontier war, of violence that was untamable. It was a psychological weapon as much as a costume. It allowed the Sons of Liberty to say, "We are not British subjects breaking the law. We are something else entirely." They painted their faces with soot and red ochre, wrapped themselves in old blankets, and spoke in a jargon that they imagined resembled indigenous dialects. It was a performance of identity separation. Carp's Defiance of the Patriots gives us a narrative of agency. It shows us a moment where ordinary people, shoemakers, apprentices, masons, took geopolitical strategy into their own hands. They understood the leverage of the deadline. They understood the symbolism of the tea. They executed a logistical miracle in 3 hours, destroying a fortune without burning a ship or killing a soul. It is a story of competence and conviction. But as with any distillate, there are impurities if you look closely enough. The narrative of the people versus the tyrant is clean, but the data is messy. Now we must pivot to the uncomfortable truths found in the ledgers and the statute books. The data disrupts the myth. That is the popular theory, a heroic stand against tyranny. Now let's look at the raw data. When we cross-reference the heroic narrative with economic history and the work of James Fichter in Tea, Consumption, Politics and Revolution, the story shifts from a simple struggle for liberty to a complex web of corporate bailouts, smuggling cartels, and a boycott that failed. The first, too big to fail bailout. To understand why the tea was in the harbour, we have to look at the London Stock Exchange, not the Boston Manifesto. In 1772, a credit crisis rocked the British Empire, triggered by the collapse of the Eyre Bank in Scotland. The East India Company, the largest corporation in the world, a company that maintained its own private army and governed the Indian subcontinent, was on the brink of bankruptcy. The East India Company had been devastated by the Bengal famine of 1770, which killed a third of the population in its tax farming territories, destroying its revenue base. Simultaneously, the company was bloated with £17 million of surplus tea rotting in London warehouses. They couldn't sell it because the taxes made it too expensive, and the American market was dominated by smuggled Dutch tea. The Tea Act of 1773 was not a punishment for the colonies, it was a bailout for the company. Parliament decided to allow the East India Company to export tea directly to America, bypassing the London auction houses and the middlemen. Crucially, the government granted a drawback, a refund, on the duties paid in England. Even with the 3-penny tax collected in America, the Townshend duty, the East India Company tea would be cheaper than the smuggled Dutch tea that the colonists had been drinking for years. The goal was to undercut the smugglers and establish a monopoly. The taxation protest was against the principle of the Townshend duty, even though the total cost was lower. This changes the motivation significantly. Who stands to lose the most from cheap legal tea? The smugglers. Men like John Hancock, one of the wealthiest men in New England, had built fortunes navigating the black market. The Tea Act threatened to wipe out their business model by making the legal product cheaper than the illegal one. This doesn't mean the liberty argument was a lie, but it suggests a powerful convergence of interest. The high-minded principles of Samuel Adams' constitutional liberty aligned perfectly with the bottom-line interests of John Hancock, monopoly protection. The Taxation Without Representation slogan was a brilliant marketing hook for a movement that was also protecting local business interests against a state-sponsored multinational monopoly. The boycott that failed. Here is where we introduce the most disruptive insight, drawing heavily from James Fichter's research. The Standard story tells us that after the Tea Party, Americans united in a rejection of British tea, switching to coffee as a patriotic duty. Fichter's analysis of trade data and merchant ledgers blasts this myth out of the water. Fichter argues that tea consumption did not collapse after 1773. In fact, 2 large shipments of East India Company tea that arrived around the time of the protests were not destroyed. They were landed, sold, and drunk. In 1775, just before the outbreak of formal war, merchants were still advertising and selling tea. The prohibition bans passed by the Continental Congress were widely flouted. One of the most fascinating findings in Fichter's work is the medical excuse. The boycott committees allowed for exceptions if tea was needed for health reasons. Suddenly, in 1774 and 1775, a suspiciously large number of colonists developed ailments that could only be cured by a cup of bohea. It became a way to signal virtue publicly while consuming the vice privately. The Patriot propaganda machine tried to gender the tea issue, portraying tea drinking as effeminate and the boycott as a masculine martial virtue. Yet women were central to the boycott's actual mechanics. They were the purchasers. Fichter notes that while men postured in public meetings, the actual cessation of tea drinking was far less absolute in the domestic sphere. The Tea Party didn't turn Americans away from tea, the war did. It was the physical blockade by the Royal Navy, not the moral fortitude of the consumers, that eventually dried up the supply. Violence and intimidation. We must also complicate the non-violent narrative. While the property destruction was targeted, the human intimidation was severe. The consignees, the merchants appointed by the East India Company to sell the tea, were terrorized. The Sons of Liberty used the tactic of the mob to strip these men of their social standing and safety. They were surrounded in their homes, their windows were smashed, and they were forced to flee to Castle William, a fortified island in the harbour, for protection. This wasn't just a debate about taxes, it was a campaign of coercion. The Liberty movement did not tolerate dissent. When we look at the primary source accounts of the tarring and feathering of customs officials, though not at the Tea Party itself, the threat hung heavy. We see the dark underbelly of the revolution. The replacement of the padlock was a performative act of order to mask a fundamental breakdown of the rule of law. The global context. A 2018 NBER paper by Galiani and Torrens adds a game-theoretic layer to this. They ask, why didn't Britain just give the Americans representation? Adam Smith suggested it. It would have solved the no taxation without representation complaint. The model suggests that the British landed gentry, the ruling coalition, feared that American representatives would align with British radicals, the Wilkesites, to overthrow the existing British order. They denied American representation not just to exploit the colonies, but to protect their own political survival in London. The Tea Party, therefore, was a clash between two fragile elites, the Boston merchants protecting their market and the British gentry protecting their parliament. So was the Boston Tea Party a heroic act? Yes, but it was also a protectionist riot led by smugglers against a corporate bailout, followed by a boycott that many people cheated on. The genius of the Sons of Liberty wasn't that they represented the unanimous will of the people. It was that they managed to turn a complex economic dispute about corporate monopolies and import duties into a binary moral choice, liberty or slavery. They distilled the complexity into a single smashable symbol, the tea chest. The distillate. So what? Why does the destruction of 92,000 pounds of dried leaves in 1773 matter to you today? Because the dynamics of the Boston Tea Party are the dynamics of modern power. 1. The crony capitalism parallel. The Boston Tea Party was, at its core, a protest against government favoritism. The British government was using legislation to prop up a failing private corporation, the East India Company, at the expense of small business owners, the colonial merchants. When you see government regulations that favor large incumbents, whether it's tax breaks for massive tech companies or bailouts for banks, you are seeing the modern Tea Act. The lesson is to look past the sticker price. The East India Company tea was cheaper, but the cost was a monopoly. Look for the hidden monopoly in the services you use today. Are you trading freedom for convenience or a lower price, just as the British hoped the colonists would? 2. The limits of consumer boycotts. Fichter's research is a cold shower for modern activists. The tea boycott was largely a failure in terms of changing behavior through moral suasion. People like their treats. They liked tea then. They like Amazon Prime now. If you want to create change, structural disruption is more effective than consumer guilt. The Patriots didn't win by just refusing to drink tea. They won by physically stopping the tea from landing, the party, and then engaging in political separation, independence. Don't just vote with your wallet. That is often a weak lever. Engage in the structural/political process. 3. The power of opting out, the Mohawk lesson. The most powerful thing the colonists did wasn't smashing the crates, it was wearing the disguise. They psychologically opted out of the British system. They stopped asking for permission to be British subjects and decided to be something else. Identify where you are waiting for permission. In your career or creative life, are you petitioning a Governor Hutchinson for a pass? Stop waiting. Adopt the Mohawk mindset, not the appropriation, but the assertion of a new identity that doesn't require the old system's validation. So, to distill it all down, the Boston Tea Party wasn't a protest against high taxes, but a rebellion against a corporate monopoly that lowered prices to buy compliance. The boycott that followed was leakier than we admit, proving that convenience often trumps principle. And the true revolution began not when the tea hit the water, but when the colonists stopped seeing themselves as British subjects and started inventing a new American identity. If you want to read the raw ledgers of the East India Company or see the primary source letters from the Mohawks, check the show notes. We've linked Benjamin Carp's Defiance of the Patriots and James Fichter's Tea. Both are essential reads for the nuanced historian. If you enjoyed this distillation of history, hit the like and subscribe icons so you don't miss next week's episode.